Welcome back, everybody, to another Nintendudez podcast. I'm Nick.
I'm Mike.
And I'm Travis.
And this is going to be a game suggestion by a really good friend of ours, Little Big Horner. He actually gave us a podcast suggestion for what is our favorite kind of graphic, and we're going to take this topic and we're going to kind of twist it to make it a little bit more of a kind of a broader discussion. And it's going to be, we're going to mention like our kind of favorite graphics and graphical styles in this podcast as well, but we're also going to mention kind of what we think is a better route for certain game developers to take, whether it's more focusing on a graphical art style or rather going for like the hyper-realistic graphics nowadays. And we're going to mention some of our favorite games or with those kind of graphical styles in there. So I want to kind of start off with more of a broad question like I usually do. So if we're talking about the kind of the older school games and the kind of transition that they had to the 3D era. So you talk about games from the Super Nintendo going into kind of like the N64, the PlayStation 1, and those kind of games from there. Holy crap, they look dated. But for some reason, those kind of Super Nintendo games still work and still look very good. And so the first question that I have for you guys is, why do you think that's there? Like, why do you think that for some reason that even though that it's a lower polygon count, why do you think it looks better to us?
Nostalgia. I think that's, I think that's really it. Super Mario 64 is an ugly game, but if a new game came out with that style and it like sold itself as a throwback to the N64 days, people would eat it up and say this looks incredible. Because people like nostalgia, and we've talked about nostalgia in a couple of podcasts in the past. But that's why I think Shovel Knight is so liked. That's why games like Celeste are so liked in terms of their art style, because it's a throwback to something fun. And then they sort of update it with like, they have higher bits, and so they have like a higher color range and stuff, so they can do a bit more with it. But people love throwbacks. People like seeing homages to older things, and so I think that's why older styles are good, not because they're still great styles, but because they're retro. And I think that retro look is something people really like.
I was actually going to take it a different route. I was going to actually say more along the lines of old school 3D was just kind of crap.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I'll say this is if you look at Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, and for those of you who is like, if it's your first time watching a video, one of my favorite games, if not my favorite game of all time, is Ocarina of Time. Those graphics suck nowadays. Like, if you literally look at Ocarina of Time and show it to a kid nowadays, their iPad can play way higher resolution games than that, and it looks like crap. But you give them, at least if they see a game like Link to the Past, it doesn't seem so different to them. It seems like kind of an easier way to transition into playing those games than the 3D games. And I just thought, for me, nostalgia definitely has something to do with it, but I would argue that those kind of Super Nintendo graphical games just work better. Like 2D games in that kind of sense just work better and work easier in that graphical style. I don't know. What do you think, Travis?
I definitely think, because I was going to make that point where it's not necessarily like the graphics themselves. They could be as pixelated as hell and you'll be like, oh, okay. But if it's 2D, you get over it because it really won't affect gameplay all that much. But, I think you and I and Mike can all say that when playing game like Super Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time, shitty graphics of that, the 3D models, as well as just really horrible platforming and stuff, just prevented you from doing something. So you just like got super pissed off that I was like, oh, why did this happen? Whereas 2D, things are so much smoother because you literally just have to like work on jumping physics. Which is the same reason why Sonic 2Ds are great and 3D is horrible, because they just don't figure that shit out.
Yeah, and so I think in the older schools of like the 3D gameplay, graphical like powers affected the gameplay more. And I think that's why, at least in my mind, if you think about the graphics of like Super Nintendo games versus Nintendo 64 games, those older school games, the graphics didn't affect it as much, but it's when you get to certain games like Ocarina of Time and whatnot, like wonky hit detection does matter, whether you hit that boss or not and everything. And I think those are kind of like, there's definitely exploits in the older games, but graphics factor more into the gameplay experience. And I think that's why, at least for me, I think that the kind of the 2D graphics that we kind of grew up with work better and seem less dated than the 3D ones, even though the 3D ones came at a newer time. That's what I think.
Yeah, well, because it's easy when you're 2D, because there's not much graphically you can do to add on to it. It's a pixel game, you know what I mean? Like, if you look at, like, Project Octopath is so beautiful with the lighting and stuff, you could never, ever do that on the SNES because the color palette just doesn't work. You could say the same thing about even Shovel Knight. You know, a game like Shovel Knight could never, ever be played on the SNES or, you know, obviously the Nintendo because the color palette doesn't work, the lighting, the shading, the textures, they just didn't have that back then. And so the only thing you can really upgrade are those things, you know, the lighting, the colors, and things like that. And so I think for that, it's really easy. You know, the upgrade isn't as much, whereas, like, you know, you compare Super Mario 64 to Mario Odyssey. I mean, dude, the upgrades are phenomenal because all of a sudden now you have so many different things. You have, like, the backdrop, you have, you know, sort of the 3D environment, and everything is so drastically changing. So I think that's why we say that. 2D can't evolve as much as 3D.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And it, like, if you look at it, just like the transition from, like, 64 all the way to Odyssey. Like, in 64, Mario's hands were basically blocks. In Odyssey, you can actually, like, see the stitching that is on, like, Mario's overalls.
Yeah.
So it's crazy to see the, like, the leaps and bounds that it goes. But in, like, the old school games, like, if we're talking, like, like old school Sonic for the Sega Genesis and the Final Fantasy VI for the Super Nintendo, which, honestly, Sonic 2 and Final Fantasy VI are some of my favorite graphical, like, styles that I've ever seen. Yeah. Like, again, even though the color palette's underpowered and everything, even what they were able to do at, like, a limited time still blows my mind. But when you see, like, those first kind of things in 3D, I remember, and one of the reasons why I remember, even though we love Pokemon, at least I know me and Travis does, I don't know about Mike, but we love Pokemon Stadium. And the first time I was able to see Pokemon Stadium, like, 3D, like, polygons battle it out in, like, an arena setting, I was flipping out and I thought it was the coolest thing. But one of the reasons that they don't want to make another Pokemon Stadium for, like, a current gen console is because that's kind of lost now. The 3DS can output, like, a crazier and more in high depth Pokemon model than what, like, they could do before. It lost its kind of shock value, and they think that it won't sell as well, which I kind of see that there's truth to, but I would still buy it in a heartbeat. But that's me being blinded by nostalgia. So in my mind, that's one of the things where I love the, like, Pokemon Stadium, but it's just that shock value isn't there anymore, and that's why, like, really the only shock value that you can get is when you get into these really high budget AAA games that have really high graphical powers, because let's face it, like, indie games can't do that. Indie games don't have the money or time to do it either. Right. So it's kind of like you have to choose between that kind of hyper realistic graphics or kind of going for people, like, sitting there and, like, being in awe, or you kind of go down the path of something like Celeste or I love the Pokemon. I loved it about Pokemon Stadium where it kind of gave you that shock value, but certain games can't do that. And even though we love those games, other people will look at those games and just be like, oh, it looks underpowered and not worth my time. And I don't like the fact that people choose their games off of that, but there are people out there who do that. So you gotta appeal to almost every audience if you want to get their money.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it depends because, like, when you're talking about, because I feel like now we're starting to steer the conversation a little bit. If we're talking about, like, how graphics impact whether or not a person wants to play it, I think it totally depends on the game. The shooter genre now is almost totally dependent on its graphics. You know, and yep. Travis, I think your brother's a good example because of what he said about Breath of the Wild.
I was going to bring that up. He said it's not
a good-looking game. I knew you were.
He's like, it looks like trash. And I'm like, this game looks gorgeous. What are you talking about? It's not going for, you know, wow, look how real he looks. It's just a beautiful artistic game.
Yeah, and I think that's partially because, like, we have this, like, we correlate graphics with genres of games. Mm-hmm. So, like, 2D platformers like Celeste don't have to be HD, but open world games like Breath of the Wild, Skyrim, we automatically assume they have to have hyper realistic graphics because and I would ask you guys to think, can you think of a single open world game that didn't go for realistic graphics? Because Breath of the Wild clearly did. It's just on the Switch, so it couldn't be as overpowered. But you can tell they were going for realistic-looking graphics for the most part, at least compared to other Zelda games like Wind Waker and Skyward Sword. So, and like Assassin's Creed Origins is another one that I really love that totally just wanted to capture the realistic look of Egypt. Whereas platformers don't do that. Mario Odyssey doesn't look realistic. It's still cartoony and fun. Little Nightmares is a game that I recently played, and that's another one that just, you know, went for that cartoon vibe of, like, creepy and ugly. So it totally just depends on the genre that you're playing, I would think.
I was going to say, because Borderlands has a different type of... because they kind of have
it's kind
that
of got Borderlands kind of got that cell shaded look.
And I was actually gonna say that's I think my favorite artistic style is that kind of style, because you can still tell exactly what everything is. You're like, okay, he's a human, that's an alien, yada yada. But because it's not going for that super HD realistic approach to it, I feel like it ages better, because I don't know how many times, like, throughout my years, even when I had the original Xbox playing Madden, my mom would come downstairs, oh wow, Travis, this game looks so realistic. I remember when it was just like a block that moved around the screen. And now I go back and play Madden 06, I'm like, this game looks like shit.
I know.
Yeah.
Like I don't have any value to play that game versus like the newest Madden, because the newest Madden just looks better. Because it's
we'll have updated players.
Exactly.
Right.
No, Mike, I was going to say, I like what you said, but I'm going to kind of take it a step further, and it also kind of depends on where those kind of genres of games got started, too. So, in your, like, what you're saying about, like, whatever, like, an open world game needed to have, like, very realistic graphics, and I would basically agree with you. But also the fact that platformers and, like, old school RPGs, like, say, Final Fantasy, they got their start where they kind of had those underpowered like those were like the good graphics at the time, and they're still able to get away with it because there's still an audience for people who want those games with that kind of graphical style or that art style. So games like Sonic, like if Sonic 2, Sonic 3, the original Sonic games on 2D never existed. Just picture this. And the first 3D, the first Sonic game that came out was Sonic Adventure. Anyway, the first 3D game was Sonic Adventure. And you say that, and then they pitch the game Sonic Mania. Everybody would look at them and just go, "Are you crazy?"
Yeah.
Like it wouldn't make any sense. But those games got their start there, and so there's going to be an audience, or there's going to be people whose first games are those games, and people who want to go back to those games as well. So I think that also that graphical style will also depend on where the kind of series or where the kind of platform got started too, or genre where they got started, because there's still going to be an audience wanting those kinds of games. So, at least in my mind, I kind of see it with like old school RPGs and platformers. And so they can get away with that. Like Celeste was able to get away with being a 2D platformer nowadays and being like a 10 out of 10 game. It was fantastic, one of the best games I've ever played. And Final Fantasy was able to do it as well. But certain games like open world games and I would say some shooters already started off kind of going for that trend, and so they keep having to follow that trend that they started out on.
Right. Well,
that's what I kind of see it as.
Would also think because it also depends on the tone of the game too, to sort of branch from genre. Because like I feel like the more serious the game is, the more realistic they make the graphics look. Like when I think of Zelda, I think the two most realistic looking Zelda games are Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild, and those are easily the most like serious and dark stories in the franchise. To that same end, like you mentioned, Travis, with Borderlands doesn't really have realistic graphics.
No.
But it's also not a serious game.
It is so
that
silly,
game is filled with jokes.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if that's why, like, Call of Duty, I don't think would be taken seriously if it had Borderlands graphics.
Huh.
You know, so I wonder if that's a part of it too, you know?
You bring up a good point, because all the ones that are trying to, like, have a... I mean, I'm not saying Call of Duty has an intense campaign story, for the most part, especially the last couple. But, you know, obviously they're going for more of the real wars that happen, so they have to kind of be more realistic in that aspect.
Right.
But yeah, like even Halo, like they tried to always be the most HD and realistic looking because it always had a more serious campaign story than other shooters and stuff. So that's
right.
No, I kind of think that's an interesting point that you gave, Mike. I totally forgot what it was. Can you say it one more time? Because I had a point going off of that.
It was the more serious the game is, the more realistic the game has, or like tends to become.
Okay, now I remember what I was going to say. So yeah, no, thank you, Travis. But so you kind of saw it, and I mean, it was almost because of the outcry of Wind Waker was the fact that Twilight Princess was made the way that it was. And even though we have multiple people in our channel that really love Wind Waker, and it is a great game, but that kind of game was going for more of like a charm and aspect of it. But again, if you put them side by side and you have Wind Waker and you have Twilight Princess, and you're going to say which one aged more, I would almost guarantee that most people would say Twilight Princess. The graphics were originally like made for the Wii and the GameCube. They weren't able to compete graphical wise. They weren't able to compete with the next gen consoles like the Xbox 360 and the PS3. So those games were like, those were the realistic graphics that they could get. But because because Nintendo was trying to go for a certain art style with Wind Waker and trying to go for like a different feel for the series, it aged better. It has, at least in my mind, has a longevity and has more of a uniqueness to go back to. Most of the time, for me, I personally love. For me, it's all based on like the gameplay and how much that I love Twilight Princess. But if you talk about like I feel like a general Zelda fan, or you pick out a Zelda fan at random and they would want to go back to a game that would feel more unique to them, I would argue that Wind Waker has a more unique feel in the way of artistic, like in the way of like an artistic style than Twilight Princess. And I think that like speaks more to the fact that these game developers kind of have to make this decision based on the game that they're making. So it wouldn't make sense for a game like Wind Waker to have like the story of Breath of the Wild or Twilight Princess, at least in my mind.
Right.
But it would make sense for them to have a little more of an upbeat story and kind of a more kind of nice humor and charm to it, like it does. So it really does depend on what kind of a game that they're developing for, and what kind of art style can match it and more enhance it and help it out rather than kind of detriment it in a way. That's
Exactly.
what I think.
Yep.
Yeah, because you can tell that Nintendo also does kind of keep them in two separate realms, considering that Link has two different characters in Smash Bros. One being Toon Link,
Yep.
and one being the Twilight Princess. And only now he's the Breath of the Wild, new one.
Right.
Yeah. But the Toon Link stays there. The Breath of the Wild, like the one Link
Toon
just
Link
keeps
will be
evolving
there to
too.
stay, I think, for a long ass time.
Yeah, I hope so.
Because like
I think
he replaced young Link because it's like it's the same Link, but you know it's not that cool. But then they're like, hey, he can now be young Link.
Yeah, but I mean, like that's I think what Nintendo's realizing, where at least from my opinion, is that the links that people have, it's very dependent on which game that which Zelda game that you fall in love with too. But games like Twilight, for me, I love Twilight Princess. I personally like Twilight Princess more than Wind Waker. But if you had to, but for me, like if you had to discuss which kind of Zelda or which kind of Link, why'd I say Zelda? That would be really bad. Which Link deserves more of a unique spot in a Smash Bros. Game, I would easily say Toon Link. Like
Right.
it wouldn't be an option. Like it wouldn't cross like a second in my mind because it's just so obvious. So I think Nintendo's recognizing that, and so they keep updating the current Link, the one that's been in there since the N64 days, the Ocarina of Time Link. But Toon Link is going to be there to stay. And I mean, I know Toon Link has kind of had like games like Spirit Tracks and Phantom Hourglass, which by the way, Phantom Hourglass sucks. But yeah, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I get what you're saying. You know, I think when companies do something that's innovative, it's always going to stand out more, obviously. Twilight Princess was realistic, but it wasn't innovative. You know, that's what a lot of games try to do, is get a realistic series-looking style. And I mean, when Wind Waker first came out, people thought it was stupid and ridiculous that they were doing cell shading. It wasn't until the game was made that people fell in love with it. So I think it's when companies take that risk, that's when they realize, you know, this was well worth it. We tried something different and unique, and it totally worked. And that's why I think Toon Link is going to be remembered for a really long time. And I think that kind of started a trend of cell shading for a few popular games out there. You know, they realized, if we do realistic, it looks great, but it's not going to stand out from the rest of them the way Wind Waker did.
And honestly, when you have, at least for the when games are such a big thing nowadays, you're going to need to have something to say that your game is different and for it to stand out from the rest of the group. If you there's no way that somebody could make a game, I don't know, called, I don't know, what rhymes with Halo? Mayo? Whatever. Like, if they called it Mayo and basically had, the same graphics, same style, same kind of shooting and whatnot as Halo, but they just called it a different name, there's not going to be much to distinguish the two.
Right.
But if I say Wind Waker, you know what Link I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
So you always have to at least have something to distinguish your game from the others, and a unique art style is one of the things that, at least in my mind, would do that in a very good way. Because in a unique art style, or a unique graphical style, you can both do it in a way where it can match the story that you're telling, even if it's darker or lighter, and it can be a game that doesn't age as hard as some of the other ones nowadays with that were going for the hyper-realistic graphics. There's few games that I remember with really good realistic graphics that still make me blown away by the graphics nowadays. With 4K, even though I don't use 4K, there's always going to be better graphics.
You know what
out
game
there.
did surprise me that honestly I thought it still looks great was Metroid Prime on the GameCube.
Yes, that's a great
beautiful
one.
Because I don't know how they did it, but I was just playing it this summer or this winter actually, and like I'm like, this still looks good compared to like all the other games. Like Melee looks pretty pixelated and dated, but like I thought Metroid Prime was smooth as hell and like looked great.
Yeah. Well, and another example I'd like to throw out there too is an indie game called Unfinished Swan that came out a long time ago. This game was interesting because it was nothing. It was just sort of this blank white world, and you throw paint on it and it sort of brings the world to life. You know, like the stairs and stuff are invisible. When you throw paint, you like reveal the staircase.
So like Color Splash.
Exactly. Well, I mean...
Color Splash confirmed, greatest game now.
This is kind of dumbing this game down if you put it that way, but
it was a joke. I'm sure it was much more innovative than Color Splash was.
No, it was cool because like, I mean, you could see some of the stuff, like the castle was still kind of colored but very lightly, but it was cool because you sort of create the world.
But Mike, did it have a hammer that brought the paint back?
I'm sick of this
conversation. Did you have Huey?
Color Splash is more innovative. Color Splash is more innovative.
All right, I take my point back. I'm done here.
I'm sorry, Mike. Do you want to continue it?
Opinion.
Whatever. I was just saying I think it's cool because like its graphical style was its lack of graphics. You sort of bring the world to life yourself.
Okay, I do like that because I also played. I don't even remember what it was called. Let's see if I actually have it on here. It was a computer game that your person was, I think, blind. So you literally had to make sounds in order to make things like appear, and it would only be there for a limited time.
That's really cool.
Yeah, so it was like I think it was a horror game style, but I wish I remembered what it was called, but it was super cool because you literally had to like throw items and then you'd be able to like kind of make out the shapes of different objects that are in the room, and you want to get to the next one, and then eventually there were like different monsters there too. So if you threw something, you alerted them that you were there, and then it was super cool.
Yeah, that is really cool.
That sounds awesome. We're gonna try to find that game.
Yeah, I'll try to figure out what it is. It was like Lurking or something like that.
Yeah, well, we'll try to figure out that game. If you know what it is, please post it in the comment section. Otherwise, we'll try to figure it out and post it in like the more info, or I don't know, we'll put it somewhere. We'll hook you guys up. Up.
Was it maybe called Perception?
Maybe. I don't know. I played it a long time ago. I know PewDiePie played it.
Okay.
So
we'll anyway, do you guys have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just close it by saying that again. I think graphics should just go with what fits the style of the game best. If you're a game like Assassin's Creed Origins that's going for like this realistic-looking Egyptian world, hyperrealism's obviously the best. But for a 2D platformer, stick to the classic retro style like Shovel Knight and Celeste. But also try to be innovative. If you're innovative like Wind Waker, I think that's good. I think it just depends on the company and what you want out of the game. Because I think graphics mean more than we think it does. I think graphics tell its own story. And it can improve upon a story. So, I think the company has to decide what works best for it. And, that's why I don't think there's a right or wrong style. I think it just depends on the game.
Yep, I agree. What about you, Travis?
I agree with what Mike was saying. Obviously it also depends on the player. Like, I don't really care how realistic you look. I don't care if I can see you literally sweating and how many beads of sweat you are dropping. Whereas other people, they're all about that and will no longer try to even think about getting a game that looks retro. But for me, as long as the story is good, I appreciate the art style it tries to choose. But I typically do enjoy the more unique ones where it's more, how much of the color palette can I put in, or like how different can I make this kind of seem. As long as it's still smooth, I'm A-okay with it.
Right.
Yep. Well, either way, Little Big Horner, thank you so much for the idea. If anybody else has any other ideas for podcast topics, make sure you use them, put it in the comment section below. Otherwise, what do you guys think about the graphical style? Do you like the hyper-realism graphics, or do you like certain kind of games going for an art style? And if you do, which ones do you like the most? Otherwise, signing off, this is Nick.
Mike.
And Travis.
Later.
Bye.
Bye.